Everyone. This is lecture 13 on the spinal cord, spinal nerves, and nerve plexuses. Okay, so this lecture is based on Martini's chapter 14 and 15. Here are the learning objectives. Here are the drawing assignments. Draw and label the spinal cord. Draw and label the spinal cord cross-section. And draw and label the spinal cord cross-section within a vertebra. That's just some simple basic stuff that it's good to draw. Okay, spinal cord overview. Just to remind ourselves, the vertebral column we already learned, and we found out that there were 7 cervical vertebrae, C1 through C7, 12 thoracic vertebrae, T1 to T12, 5 lumbar vertebrae, L1 to L5, 1 sacrum, composed of S1 to S5 fused together, 1 coccyx or tailbone, coccyx 1 to coccyx 5, but could be 3 to 5 coccygeal vertebrae fused together. Most often it's 4, but different in different people. And now on to the spinal cord. The spinal cord starts at the foramen magnum, the hole in the base of the occipital bone, and extends to the L1 vertebrae in an adult. L1 is at about the level of the 12th rib. The spinal cord has 31 spinal cord segments. The tapered end of the spinal cord is called the conus medullaris. Hanging down from the spinal cord is the cauda equina, or tail of a horse. The cauda equina is the dorsal and ventral roots, dorsal root ganglia, and spinal nerves of the L1 to coccygeal 1 segments of the spinal cord. The spinal nerves leave the vertebral column from the intervertebral foramen or sacral foramina. And I know that right now you don't know what these words mean, but it will all come clear over the course of the lecture. The function of the spinal cord is to bring information from the peripheral nervous system to the brain and from the brain to the peripheral nervous system. Some sensory and motor pathways, like the reflex arc of a monosynaptic reflex, like the patellar reflex, are found completely within the spinal cord. Cerebrospinal fluid. The spinal cord is surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid and has a central canal full of cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid is continuous with the cerebrospinal fluid that surrounds the brain and that fills cavities within the brain. So we'll see this again when we learn the brain. Cerebrospinal fluid acts as a shock absorber for the spinal cord and brain. It delivers oxygen and nutrients to the spinal cord and brain. It removes carbon dioxide, waste products, and excess neurotransmitter from the spinal cord and brain. So it's quite handy. Okay, the meninges of the spinal cord. The spinal cord has 3 surrounding membranes, or meninges. These are connective tissue structures that protect the spinal cord. The deepest meninge is the pia mater, or delicate mother. The middle meninge is the arachnoid mater, or spider mother. And the most superficial meninge is the dura mater, or hard mother. All 3 meninges also surround the dorsal and ventral roots, dorsal root ganglia, spinal nerves, and superiorly, the brain. And again, we'll learn what all of these structures are in the course of the lecture. The pia mater is firmly bound to the spinal cord. It contains the blood vessels that supply the spinal cord. From L1 to coccygeal 1, the pia mater forms the filum terminale, or the terminal thread. The filum terminale anchors the end of the spinal cord to the coccyx. So you can look at the picture there. The pia mater is connected to the dura mater by small ligaments. The ligaments anchor the spinal cord within the dura. They prevent side-to-side and upward and downward movement of the spinal cord. The arachnoid mater is connected to the pia mater by fibers called arachnoid trabeculae. The space between the two is called the subarachnoid space. It is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. A clinical correlation for the subarachnoid space is that when cerebrospinal fluid is needed for clinical testing, a lumbar puncture or spinal tap may be performed. Cerebrospinal fluid is taken from the subarachnoid space. Anesthesia may be injected into the subarachnoid space. This is called spinal anesthesia, and it actually works quite well. And you can look at the picture there. You'll see that they are performing the spinal tap between L3 and L4 vertebrae. In addition, if they needed to give spinal anesthesia, they could use this same space between L3 and L4 vertebrae to deliver the spinal anesthesia. Okay, back to our meninges. The dura mater is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue in a tough fibrous layer. The dura mater forms a dural sac or thecal sac that contains the cerebral spinal fluid that surrounds the spinal cord. Something's got to keep it in, or it would, be leaking all over the place, right? The dura mater is tightly attached to the arachnoid mater. The subdural space between the two is a potential space, which means that there's no actual space between them unless there's some kind of a disease process that's causing blood or fluid to create an actual space between the two. The dura mater is attached to the edge of the foramen magnum superiorly. It's attached to the sacrum and coccyx inferiorly, and laterally the dura mater is held in place because it continues as a covering of the ventral and dorsal roots, dorsal root ganglia, and spinal nerves. Between the dura mater and the wall of the vertebral column is the epidural space. The epidural space contains adipose connective tissue and areolar connective tissue and a lot of blood vessels. Epidural space clinical correlation. Epidural anesthesia is injected into the epidural space. It is used to block pain but maintain some motor function. Epidural anesthesia is often used in labor, and you will hear people say, "I had an epidural during my labor," meaning they had epidural anesthesia. Okay, spinal cord organization. First of all, note that in the cross sections of the spinal cord that we'll be looking at in this section, the posterior of the spinal cord is shown at the top of the picture and the anterior is shown at the bottom. I'm calling this to your attention because usually when we see cross sections of the body, they're seen in the opposite way, as though the person was laying on their back and their anterior was on the top of the picture. So just get that straight in your mind now before we continue, hopefully. So the spinal cord has gray matter in the center surrounded by white matter. The gray matter consists of the cell bodies of neurons. The white matter mostly consists of myelinated axons, although there are some unmyelinated axons in the white matter also. The gray matter is shaped like a butterfly with the lower wings posterior. The gray matter has areas called posterior, lateral, and anterior horns. You can check out where those are. The posterior and anterior gray commissures, or joining togethers, are areas in the center of the gray matter where the axons of neurons can cross to the other side of the gray matter. The anterior white commissure is an area in the center of the white matter where sensory and motor axons cross to the other side of the spinal cord. There is no posterior white commissure. Okay, now spinal cord organization of nuclei. Collections of cell bodies of neurons in the central nervous system are called nuclei. I don't know why they couldn't have thought of another word, but nuclei is what got used, and that's what we're stuck with. The posterior of the gray matter contains sensory nuclei, and the anterior of the gray matter in the spinal cord contains motor nuclei. The function of the neurons in the sensory nuclei is to receive sensory information from the periphery and send it to the brain. The function of the neurons in the motor nuclei is to receive motor commands from the brain and send the motor commands to the periphery. The sensory and motor nuclei are grouped by function. There are somatic and visceral sensory and motor nuclei. And just a reminder, since it's easy to forget, somatic means pertaining to sensory information from skeletal muscles, tendons, and joints, or the control of skeletal muscle activity. Visceral means pertaining to sensory information from visceral organs or the control of visceral organ activity. So just to remind you, when we're saying that there are somatic and visceral sensory and motor nuclei, what we're referring to, okay? So now